Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
The Soul of Stolen Art. Chapter 1. A Most Unsettling Cuppa. The late afternoon sun, a pale, watery imitation of its summer self, slanted across the drawing room of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, dappling the chintz armchairs and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A fire crackled merrily in the grate, casting a warm glow that, for all its cheer, couldn't quite banish the creeping chill that seemed to have settled over St. Mary Mead these past few weeks. It wasn't merely the weather, though the village gossips had much to say about the unseasonable damp. No, there was a palpable tension, a quiet hum beneath the polite facade of village life, much like the barely audible drone of a bumblebee trapped in a jam jar. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking with rhythmic precision, paused to adjust her spectacles. She was engaged in the arduous task of turning the heel of a sock, a deceptively simple act that required a good deal of concentration. Across from her, Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a particularly vibrant floral frock that clashed rather spectacularly with the aforementioned chintz, was attempting to balance a teacup on a saucer with one hand whilst gesticulating wildly with the other. "Simply scandalous, Jane, I tell you," Mrs. Bantry declared, nearly upending her Earl Grey. "First the Rosetta Stone, then the Nefertiti bust. It's beyond comprehension. What is the world coming to?" Miss Marple merely offered a small, knowing smile. "Well, dear Pamela, human nature, I dare say, remains much the same, doesn't it? Though the stage upon which it plays out seems to grow ever larger. But these aren't simply pilferings from a grand country house, are they?" Mrs. Bantry countered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, despite the fact that only the cat, a placid ginger named Marmalade, was within earshot. "These are national treasures. Symbols. And that message, I am returning what was stolen. So self-righteous. Like something out of a penny dreadful." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, selecting a new ball of yarn. "Though sometimes, dear Pamela, life itself can be more peculiar than any penny dreadful, wouldn't you agree? I recall Mrs. Hemingway's prize-winning fuchsias, for instance. Everyone suspected young Timothy, with his reputation for mischief, but it turned out to be the vicar's goat, driven to distraction by a sudden craving for exotic blooms." Mrs. Bantry snorted inelegantly. "A goat, Jane, is hardly comparable to an international art thief. Though, I suppose, both are rather stubborn and have a penchant for taking what isn't theirs." She took a large gulp of tea, then leaned forward, her eyes bright with a mixture of horror and fascination. "And the papers? Oh, the headlines. Cultural Cold War looms. Nations divided. It's all so terribly modern, isn't it? All this talk of digital messages and global manhunts. Modern tools, perhaps, but the motivations, I suspect, are as old as time," Miss Marple observed, her gaze drifting towards the window, where the first hint of twilight was beginning to paint the sky in hues of soft grey and lavender. "Jealousy, resentment, a desire for recognition, or perhaps, simply a misguided sense of justice. It reminds me a little of the unpleasantness with the Prothero's prize-winning marrow at the village fete. Everyone knew Mr. Prothero had acquired the seeds from old Farmer Giles under rather dubious circumstances, and then, lo and behold, his magnificent marrow mysteriously vanished the night before judging. No one was truly surprised, you understand. A certain natural justice, some called it. But this curator, as they're calling this mysterious thief, seems to have a rather grander sense of justice, Mrs. Bantry mused, her brow furrowing. And no demands. That's what's so unnerving. If they wanted money or political concessions, one could at least understand. But simply returning what was stolen? To whom, one wonders. And where? Just then, a sharp rap echoed through the cottage, causing Mrs. Bantry to jump. Miss Marple, however, merely offered another serene smile. Ah, that will be Colonel Weston, I expect. He mentioned he might drop by for a chat about his new rose bushes. Though I dare say his curiosity about this international kerfuffle will also be quite piqued. Colonel Weston, a man of robust constitution and an even more robust opinion on most matters, soon bustled into the drawing-room, bringing with him a faint scent of pipe tobacco and damp tweed. Evening, ladies. Terrible business, this, terrible. Empire's crumbling, I tell you. Can't even keep hold of our national treasures now without some artistic brigand making off with them. He settled into an armchair with a theatrical sigh, his eyes immediately falling upon the newspaper spread across a small table. Interpol agent on the case, they say. One Inspector Dubois. French, naturally. Though, one hopes he's rather more effective than that rather incompetent Inspector Book from the Orient Express affair. Remember that, Jane? A fine kettle of fish, that was. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Indeed, Colonel. Though Inspector Book, as I recall, had a rather challenging case on his hands. Human nature, you see, can be remarkably intricate when placed under due duress. Intricate, yes, but surely not so complex as to outwit a seasoned detective. Colonel Weston harumphed, before lowering his voice. Though, between you and me, Jane, there's talk. Whispers. Some say this curator is a hero. Righting historical wrongs, and all that rot. Others call him a dangerous fanatic, destabilizing the world order. What do you make of it? Miss Marple poured the Colonel a fresh cup of tea, her movements unhurried. Well, Colonel, it does put one in mind of that rather peculiar incident with the village pageant, doesn't it? When Mrs. McGillicuddy's ancestral brooch, meant to be the centerpiece of Queen Boudicca's costume, vanished. Everyone assumed young Peter with his penchant for practical jokes. But it turned out Mrs. McGillicuddy herself had merely misplaced it, only to discover it had fallen behind the grandfather clock during a rather enthusiastic dusting. Appearances, you see, can be so deceiving. Mrs. Bantry exchanged a knowing glance with the Colonel. They were both accustomed to Miss Marple's rather circuitous analogies, which often seemed to wander off into the quiet lanes of village life before, quite unexpectedly, arriving at the very heart of the matter. So you think it's all a misunderstanding, Jane? Mrs. Bantry pressed, always eager to cut to the chase. That this curator isn't really a master thief, but perhaps a muddle-headed museum employee. Miss Marple gave a delicate cough. Not precisely, dear Pamela. But I do believe that even the grandest of international incidents often have their roots in very ordinary human failings, or perhaps, desires. And sometimes, what appears to be a grand gesture is merely a very small person trying to make a very large point. Like little Timmy Higgins, who stole Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning pumpkin not because he wanted the pumpkin itself, but because he was desperate for attention after his parents forgot his birthday. The motive, you see, is always the crucial thing. Colonel Weston stroked his chin thoughtfully. Motive, yes. And who benefits? Always the first question in any good investigation. Who benefits from nations squabbling over old pots and statues? Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, her eyes, though seemingly mild, holding a depth of understanding that went far beyond the village green. And sometimes, Colonel, the person who benefits most is the one no one would ever suspect. The one who appears to have no stake in the game whatsoever. Like the quiet mouse who manages to pilfer the crumbs from beneath the very nose of the plumpest cat, simply because the cat is too busy watching the bird at the window. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the last vestiges of daylight faded, and the gentle quiet of St. Mary Mead settled once more. But in the small drawing-room, Miss Marple's words hung in the air, subtle as a whisper, yet as sharp as the point of her knitting needle, hinting at a truth far more complex than any newspaper headline could ever convey. The game, it seemed, was already afoot. Chapter 2: An Unexpected Visitor. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, a welcome respite from the dreary damp. Miss Marple was in her garden, a place where she often did her most profound thinking. Dressed in her customary tweed skirt and a comfortable cardigan, with a pair of sturdy gardening gloves protecting her hands, she was gently snipping the dead heads from her beloved roses. The rhythmic snip-snip of her secateurs was a comforting sound, a small anchor of order in a world that, according to the wireless and the morning papers, seemed to be teetering on the brink of chaos. She had just finished tending to a particularly fine specimen of a zephyrine drowend when the unfamiliar purr of a powerful motorcar disturbed the village peace. It was a sleek, dark grey vehicle, the sort one saw in London but rarely in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. It slowed and came to a halt directly in front of her gate. The driver's door opened, and a young man emerged. He was tall and well-built, dressed in a sharp, city-smart suit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of hollyhocks and climbing ivy. He stood for a moment, his brow furrowed with a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. A slow smile touched Miss Marple's lips. "David," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "My dear boy, what a surprise!" The young man's face broke into a relieved, if strained, smile. "Aunt Jane," he said, striding up the garden path. "I was hoping I'd find you here." This was David Croft, her great-nephew, the son of her favorite nephew Raymond's wife's sister. It was a slightly convoluted connection, as village relations often were, but he had always been Aunt Jane to him. David was a clever boy, a serious boy, who had gone into a line of work that the family rarely discussed in detail, speaking of it in vague terms like government service or international liaison. Miss Marple, however, with her keen understanding of euphemisms, knew perfectly well that he worked for Interpol. He bent to kiss her papery cheek, and she patted his arm. "You look tired, dear boy. Come inside. Griselda has just put the kettle on. There is nothing a good cup of tea cannot mend, or at least, make more bearable." Once settled in the familiar chintz armchairs, with a plate of Griselda's excellent seed cake between them, David's professional composure began to fray at the edges. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of agitation Miss Marple had known since he was a boy struggling with his Latin declensions. "It's this business, Aunt Jane," he began, foregoing any small talk. "The Curator affair." "I'm leading the investigation." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had made their customary appearance, paused mid-click. "I had wondered," she said softly. It seemed the sort of complicated, international affair that would require a steady hand. "I am very proud of you, David." "Proud?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I feel as though I'm trying to catch smoke with a butterfly net. The thefts were impossible. No alarms tripped, no witnesses, no forensic evidence to speak of. It's as if the Rosetta Stone simply floated out of the British Museum. And the message, this digital note, it's a ghost. bounced through so many servers and proxies it's effectively untraceable. We have the best minds in the world on it, and we are getting precisely nowhere." He fell silent, staring into the depths of his teacup as if seeking an answer there. "And it is causing a great deal of unpleasantness, I gather," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Unpleasantness is putting it mildly," David sighed. "The Egyptians are demanding the immediate return of the Nefertiti bust from the Germans, claiming this proves they can't protect it. The Greeks are using it to strengthen their case for the Elgin marbles. Old political wounds are being ripped open all over the globe. Every nation is a suspect and a victim at the same time. The pressure is immense." He looked up, his eyes troubled. "And the worst part, Aunt Jane, the very worst part, is that I can see his point." Miss Marple selected a piece of seed cake. "The curator's point, you mean?" "Yes," David admitted in a low voice. "This idea of returning what was stolen. There's a logic to it. A sort of mad, poetic justice. And that makes it harder. It's not a simple case of greed. This person, whoever he is, believes he is on a moral crusade. How do you fight an enemy who believes he is a hero?" Miss Marple took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. "It puts one in mind," she said, her voice thoughtful, "of poor Mr. Abernethy, who used to live in the cottage at the end of the lane. He and his neighbor, Mr. Pye, had a dispute that had simmered for 50 years over the exact placement of the fence between their gardens. It was a matter of only 6 inches, you understand, but to them it was a matter of ancestral right and principle. Mr. Pye claimed his grandfather had planted a prize-winning rosebush on that very strip of land." David listened patiently, a familiar expression of fond exasperation on his face. "Well," Miss Marple continued, "one morning, the village awoke to find that Mr. Pye had, in the dead of night, moved the entire fence 6 inches into Mr. Abernethy's garden. There was a terrible uproar, of course. The constable was called. But the strange thing was, Mr. Pye didn't try to cultivate the land. He didn't plant anything on it. He simply moved the fence." "What was the point of that?" David asked, intrigued despite himself. "Ah, that was the cleverness of it," Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It wasn't about the land at all, you see. It was about making a statement. About proving a historical point that he felt had been ignored. He forced everyone to look at the old maps, to talk to the oldest residents, to re-examine the entire history of the dispute. The act itself was illegal, of course, but his motive was to force a conversation that no one wanted to have. He wasn't a thief, David. He was, in his own mind, a historian." David stared at her, the analogy sinking in. "A historian," he repeated slowly. "Someone trying to rewrite history by rearranging the exhibits." "Precisely. And that, I suspect, is a very different sort of person from your common criminal." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, dear boy, was there anything else? Anything at all that seemed out of place? A small thing, perhaps, that seemed to have no bearing on the matter?" David hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "It's likely nothing. A red herring. But at both museums, in London and in Berlin, tucked away in a corner of the empty display case, our people found a single, freshly cut white rose. Perfectly formed. No thorns. We can't account for it. No visitor logs show anyone carrying flowers, and the staff are adamant. It's just there." Miss Marple's hand stilled in her lap. A single white rose. It was a detail of no practical value to a police investigation focused on digital trails and international politics. It was a poet's gesture, not a thief's. How very particular, she murmured, her gaze distant, looking past her great-nephew, past the cosy confines of her drawing-room, towards a puzzle that was far more intricate than anyone yet imagined. A white rose. Now, that does suggest a very specific sort of personality, doesn't it? Chapter 3. A thorny new neighbor. Several days passed, during which the affair of the curator continued to dominate the headlines. The world, it seemed, had divided itself into two distinct camps, those who saw the thief as a dangerous terrorist, and those who secretly, or not so secretly, admired his audacity. In St. Mary Mead, opinion was similarly split, providing endless fuel for conversation over garden fences and in the queue at the baker's. It was during this period of simmering global tension that a fresh piece of local gossip, far more immediate and tangible, swept through the village. Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with the thrill of imparting sensational news, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage one afternoon, barely waiting for the door to be opened before she began. "Jane, you will simply not believe it. Old Hall. It's been sold at last. And you'll never guess to whom." Miss Marple, who had been peacefully potting some geranium cuttings, straightened up and removed her gardening gloves. "Well, Pamela, since you have clearly hurried all the way from the village to tell me, I imagine it must be someone of note." "Note is not the word for it," Mrs. Bantry declared, following her friend into the drawing-room. "It's Sir Alistair Finch. The Sir Alistair Finch. The one who was director of the British Museum until he retired in a huff 6 months ago." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. This was, she had to admit, rather more intriguing than Mrs. Higgins's cat having another litter of kittens. "Indeed? How very curious. I had thought he would retire to Oxford or Cambridge, surrounded by his books." "Exactly." Mrs. Bantry sank into an armchair. "But no, he has chosen St. Mary Mead. For the peace and quiet, apparently." "Peace and quiet." "With the whole world in an uproar over the theft of his prized possession. The timing, Jane, is positively scandalous. Colonel Weston is convinced he's hiding from the press. But I wonder if there isn't more to it than that." Miss Marple poured them both a glass of her homemade lemonade. She knew what Pamela was implying. A man of Sir Alistair's reputation, brilliant, certainly, but also known to be intensely passionate, argumentative, and fiercely critical of government policy regarding antiquities, moving to their quiet village at this precise moment was a coincidence of the most remarkable kind. He had, on more than one occasion, been quoted in the Times as saying that Western museums were merely glorified custodians and that the true ownership of history was a moral, not a legal, question. It would seem, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that a welcoming visit is in order. Perhaps on behalf of the Church Roof Fund. Newcomers should always be made to feel a part of the community, don't you think? 2 days later, armed with a leaflet about the church roof and a plate of Griselda's shortbread, Miss Marple made her way up the winding drive to Old Hall. The house, a handsome Georgian structure, had an air of neglect about it, but signs of new life were evident. Crates were stacked on the veranda, and the sound of hammering echoed from within. She was met at the door by Sir Alistair himself. He was a tall, stooping man with a shock of unruly white hair and eyes as sharp and blue as a kingfisher's wing. He peered at her over a pair of half-moon spectacles, an expression of academic impatience on his face. "Yes," he said, his voice dry as dust. "Sir Alistair Finch." Miss Marple began, employing her most pleasantly flustered persona. "I do hope I am not disturbing you. I am Miss Marple, from the village. We are all so delighted to welcome you to St. Mary Mead, and I was just wondering if you might be interested in making a small contribution to our poor church roof." For a moment, it seemed he might close the door in her face. But then his eyes fell to the plate of shortbread, and a flicker of something, perhaps amusement, softened his severe expression. "I see. A tactical assault armed with baked goods. Very well, you had better come in." The inside of the house was a chaotic landscape of books. Towers of them stood like ancient pillars in the grand entrance hall, their leather-bound spines filling the air with a rich, scholarly scent. Sir Alistair led her into a vast library where more books were being unpacked by two long-suffering-looking men. "A dreadful business, all this," Miss Marple remarked, settling herself carefully on the edge of a packing crate. "The news from London, I mean. It must be a great personal blow to you." Sir Alistair snorted, picking up a heavy tome and running a hand over its cover. "A blow to national pride, perhaps. The work of a theatrical vandal. The methods are contemptible, utterly without finesse. It shows a shocking lack of respect." "For the museum, you mean?" "For the object itself," he snapped, his eyes flashing. "These artifacts are not mere stones and trinkets, Miss Marple. They are survivors of history. They have a voice, a presence. To treat them like loot in a common smash and grab is the height of vulgarity." His passion was palpable. It was not the anger of a bureaucrat whose inventory had been disrupted, but the fury of a true believer whose idol had been desecrated. "Some people," Miss Marple ventured softly, "are calling the thief a hero. Someone righting old wrongs." A strange expression crossed Sir Alistair's face. It was a mixture of scorn and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Romantic nonsense. Justice achieved through criminality is merely a more poetic form of anarchy. However—" He paused, placing the book carefully on a shelf. "The underlying sentiment, the notion that these objects possess a spirit that yearns for its native soil, only an intellectual brute would fail to comprehend that." He had, in one breath, condemned the crime and sympathized with the motive. Miss Marple filed the observation away. After a few more minutes of polite conversation, during which Sir Alistair made a surprisingly generous donation to the church roof, she rose to leave. As he walked her to the door, she paused, her gaze drawn to the gardens visible through the tall French windows. Much of it was overgrown, a tangle of weeds and unruly shrubs. But one section, to the side of the house, was a model of perfect order. It was a rose garden, filled with dozens of bushes, all meticulously pruned. And every single one was heavy with magnificent, flawless white blooms. "Oh!" Miss Marple exclaimed with genuine admiration. "What exquisite roses! Such a beautiful display." Sir Alistair's stern face softened with pride. "Ah, yes. My one concession to horticulture. The Weisberg varietal. A passion of mine. They require a great deal of precision and care to cultivate to this standard. One of the few things of true, unambiguous beauty this country can still produce." He looked at the roses with an intensity that was almost proprietorial. Miss Marple thanked him again and made her way down the drive, her mind a whirl of activity. A recently retired museum director with a declared sympathy for the idea of cultural repatriation, an expert in the very field from which the items were stolen, now living in seclusion. And, most tellingly of all, a passionate cultivator of the perfect, thornless white rose. It was, she thought, a great deal more than mere coincidence. St. Mary Mead, it seemed, had just acquired a most fascinating, and very thorny, new resident. Chapter 4: Tea, Sympathy, and a Third Rose. The annual vicarage garden party, held in aid of the Missionaries' Fund, was in full, genteel swing. The lawn, still damp from a morning shower, was dotted with villagers making polite conversation while balancing teacups and plates of slightly curling sandwiches. Miss Marple, seated beneath the shade of a large cedar tree, had a perfect vantage point from which to observe the gentle ebb and flow of St. Mary Mead society. Mrs. Bantry, at her side, provided a breathless commentary. "Look, Jane, there's Sir Alistair. Can you believe the nerve? He's talking to the vicar. Probably complaining about the state of the church roof, even after his donation. He looks utterly miserable, doesn't he? Like a thundercloud in a tweed jacket." Indeed, Sir Alistair Finch did not look like a man enjoying a village fete. He stood stiffly, a teacup held awkwardly in his large hands, looking profoundly out of his element. Colonel Weston was attempting to engage him in a hearty discussion, gesturing towards the rose beds, but Sir Alistair's responses were clipped and dismissive. He was a man isolated by his own intellect, a shark forced to swim in a paddling pool. Miss Marple's attention, however, was soon drawn to a newcomer. A young woman, smartly dressed in a practical but stylish linen suit, was making her way purposefully across the lawn. She was not a local, she had the brisk, confident air of someone from London, or perhaps even further afield. "Now who on earth is that?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, her curiosity piqued. "Staying at the Blue Boar, so I hear. An American. An author, or a journalist, or some such thing." The young woman, as if guided by an invisible thread, made a direct line for Sir Alistair. "Sir Alistair," she said, her voice clear with a transatlantic accent. "Eleanor Vance. We met briefly at the symposium in Vienna last year." Sir Alistair's face tightened. "Miss Vance. I remember. You wrote that rather pointed critique of my tenure for the New York Review of Art. A gilded cage, I believe you called it." "I called for a more dynamic approach to cultural exchange," she corrected smoothly, undeterred by his frosty reception. "This dreadful Curator business, for example. Tragic, of course. But it does force a conversation, doesn't it? It proves my point that artifacts can't remain static. They are part of a global dialogue. They are part of history, Miss Vance," he retorted, his voice low and intense. "Not pawns in a global dialogue. Your modern theories seek to turn museums into lending libraries. It is a profound misunderstanding of what it means to preserve the past." Their exchange was brief, but charged with a current of professional rivalry and ideological opposition. To a casual observer, it was a simple academic disagreement. To Miss Marple, it looked very much like two experts circling one another, their shared passion for a subject manifesting as sharp-edged conflict. Later that evening, as twilight settled over her garden, the purr of a familiar motorcar once again broke the quiet. David Croft looked even more haggard than on his last visit. He sank into an armchair without even waiting for the offer of tea, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "He's struck again, Aunt Jane," he said, his voice flat. "Paris. The Louvre." Miss Marple paused, her sherry glass halfway to her lips. "Good heavens. Not the—" "No, not the Mona Lisa, thank God," David sighed. "Something equally symbolic, though. The Zodiac of Dendera. Taken by Napoleon's army from Egypt. The pattern is undeniable. And the modus operandi was identical. No alarms, no witnesses, nothing. It just vanished." He looked up, his eyes bleak. And a single white rose was left in the empty display case. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, processing the information. The audacity was breathtaking. The thief was not merely stealing, he was making a series of carefully curated historical statements. This, of course, makes things very difficult for your investigation, she said softly. Difficult doesn't begin to cover it, David said, rubbing his temples. It's impossible. And to make matters worse, our prime suspect is no longer a suspect. Miss Marple looked at him, her expression calm. So Alistair, you mean? David stared at her, astonished. How could you possibly? My dear boy, she chided gently, when a man of Sir Alistair's prominence moves to a small village at such a time, he naturally becomes an object of interest. It would be foolish not to consider him. But you say he is no longer a suspect. An alibi, I presume. Ironclad, David confirmed glumly. At the exact time of the Paris theft, he was having dinner with the Home Secretary and 2 other members of Parliament at a club in London. We had him under discreet surveillance, of course. He couldn't have been in 2 places at once. So, the obvious solution was not the solution at all. Miss Marple felt a familiar flicker of intellectual excitement. This was a proper puzzle. Sir Alistair, the passionate expert with a garden full of white roses, could not be the curator. And what of the young American lady? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. The journalist, Miss Vance, who is staying at the Blue Boar. David frowned. Eleanor Vance? We know of her. A respected, if controversial, art historian. Specializes in repatriation law. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason in particular, Miss Marple said vaguely. It is simply that she and Sir Alistair had a most fascinating conversation at the vicarage party this afternoon. They are clearly rivals. And yet, their passion for the subject seems quite equal. She picked up her knitting, the needles beginning their soft, rhythmic dance. It reminds me of old Mr. Harrison and Mr. Green, the gardeners over at Little Paddocks. They were bitter rivals at the village flower show for years. Then, one year, a new rose appeared. A beautiful hybrid, unlike anything seen before. Mr. Harrison entered it and won first prize. But everyone knew he was a master cultivator, not a breeder. And Mr. Green, you see, was a brilliant breeder but had no patience for the delicate business of cultivation. David looked at her, a slow dawn of understanding on his face. What are you saying, Aunt Jane? I am saying, my dear, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes fixed on her intricate stitchwork, that when a single rose appears, which seems to be the work of 2 entirely different sets of hands, it is usually because 2 sets of hands were involved in its creation. You have been looking for one person, David. A brilliant, solitary figure. Perhaps you should be looking for 2. Chapter 5, A Lunch at the Blue Boar. David's visit had left a new and intriguing possibility hanging in the air of Miss Marple's tidy cottage, the theory of a partnership. It was a notion that shifted the entire shape of the puzzle. A single, passionate idealist was one thing, a pair of conspirators, working in concert, suggested a far more complex and deliberate undertaking. It really is the most baffling case, Mrs. Bantry remarked a few days later, as she and Miss Marple strolled through the village. Do you suppose your nephew is any closer to catching this curator person? David is very methodical, Miss Marple replied, her tone non-committal. But it is a puzzle with many peculiar pieces. Speaking of which, Pamela, I find I have a sudden craving for the steak and kidney pie at the Blue Boar. They make it so wonderfully well. Shall we treat ourselves to lunch? The Blue Boar was the heart of St. Mary Mead's modest social life, a charming old coaching inn with low-beamed ceilings and the comforting scent of beeswax and ale. Miss Marple selected a quiet table in a corner, which afforded a discreet view of the entire dining room. As she had hoped, Miss Eleanor Vance was seated by the window, a notebook open before her, a half-empty glass of lemonade at her elbow. They had just given their order to the landlord when the door opened again and Sir Alastair Finch strode in. He paused, his eyes scanning the room with undisguised distaste before they settled on Miss Vance. With a sigh of martyred resignation, he made his way to her table. "Well, they certainly don't look like bosom friends," Mrs. Bantry whispered, leaning conspiratorially towards Miss Marple. "He looks as though he's about to be served a summons." "An interview for her book, perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her attention fixed on the pair. Their conversation began in low tones, but as it progressed, their voices rose, sharpened by the edge of academic disagreement. It was a fascinating performance. To argue that the Parthenon marbles should be subject to a rotating international exhibition is, frankly, the talk of a dilettante, Eleanor, Sir Alastair declared, his voice cutting across the gentle hum of the dining room. "It treats priceless history like a travelling circus. And to keep them locked away under one roof, Alastair, is the talk of a jailer," she countered, her American accent crisp and clear. "You speak of preservation, but what you mean is possession. Art breathes. It needs to move, to be seen, to be debated. It needs to be understood in its context. You cannot understand the Rosetta Stone in a vacuum in Cairo any more than you can in London. Its context is now the story of its decipherment, a story that belongs to the world. A story that began with its theft." On and on it went, a dizzying volley of names, dates, and conflicting theories. They argued about the Benin bronzes, the coin or diamond, and the bust of Nefertiti. To Mrs. Bantry, it was simply an unseemly squabble. "Good heavens," she muttered. "They can't agree on a single thing. Fancy being so passionate about dusty old relics. They're certainly not partners in crime, Jane. They'd have murdered each other by now." Miss Marple said nothing. She was watching their hands, their expressions. She saw the way Sir Alastair's eyes lit up, even in anger, when he made a particularly sharp point. She saw the flicker of respect in Miss Vance's face when he quoted a line of obscure Greek text. Theirs was not the cold animosity of enemies, but the fiery, passionate engagement of two people utterly consumed by the same subject. It was the intellectual equivalent of a lover's quarrel. At last, Sir Alastair pushed his chair back abruptly. "This is pointless. Your theories are designed for newspaper headlines, not for serious scholarship. I believe this interview is concluded." He stood, gave a curt nod, and swept out of the inn. Miss Vance watched him go, a curious expression on her face, frustration mixed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. She gathered her notebook and papers, paid her bill, and departed a few moments later. As the landlord, Mr. Tugwell, came to clear their table, Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed a small, dark red book lying on the cushioned bench where Miss Vance had been sitting. "Oh, Mr. Tugwell," she said, her voice mild. "It appears the young lady has forgotten her book." "Ah, so she has," the landlord said, picking it up. It was a slim volume of poetry. As he lifted it, a small slip of white paper fluttered from its pages onto the floor. He bent to retrieve it, but Miss Marple's gaze was quicker. She did not need her spectacles to read the heading on the receipt, nor the items listed below it. The name on the receipt was Kepler Advanced Electronics, Tottenham Court Road. The items listed were a miniature GPS scrambler, a set of microtransmitters, and a spool of high-tensile, low-friction polymer wire. The date of purchase was 2 days before the zodiac of Dendera had vanished from the Louvre. Mr. Tugwell, oblivious, tucked the receipt neatly back into the book. "I'll keep this safe for her behind the bar," he said cheerfully. She'll be back for it, I'm sure." "I am quite sure she will," Miss Marple agreed, her voice serene. Mrs. Bantry, still dissecting the couple's argument, had noticed nothing. But Miss Marple was quiet for the rest of the lunch. Her mind was carefully arranging the pieces. A passionate historian who publicly argued against the very crimes being committed. A brilliant academic with an encyclopedic knowledge of historical grievances. A woman who bought the sort of sophisticated equipment that could make an impossible theft possible. The partnership theory no longer seemed merely plausible. It now had a name, a motive, and, most disturbingly, a receipt. Chapter 6 At the Weed in the Rose Bed. A contemplative quiet had settled over St. Mary Mead in the days following the curious lunch at the Blue Boar. The pieces of the puzzle, as Miss Marple saw them, were laid out in her mind like the patches in her quilting basket, some vivid, some plain, and all waiting to be stitched together. The receipt for the electronic equipment was a particularly vivid patch, a splash of stark, modern color against the tweed-like background of the case. It pointed so neatly, so perfectly, to Miss Vance. She was in her garden, gently staking a delphinium that had begun to lean after a recent downpour, when the telephone rang. Its shrill summons was an intrusion on the afternoon's peace. It was David. He dispensed with pleasantries, his voice tight with the frustration that travelled clearly down the crackling line from London. "Aunt Jane, we're back to square one." "Worse than square one." "Oh dear," Miss Marple said calmly, settling into her telephone chair. "That does sound vexing. Have you had a setback?" "A setback?" He gave a weary laugh. "We followed up on your suggestion. About Miss Vance. Put a team on her background. And we found her alibi for the first theft. The Rosetta Stone." Miss Marple waited. "She was in New York," David said, his voice flat with defeat. "Delivering the keynote address at a symposium on museum ethics at Columbia University. There were 400 witnesses, a live video stream, and a reception with the university's provost afterwards. She couldn't have been within 3,000 miles of the British Museum. So there it was. A neat, tidy, and utterly immovable fact. Sir Alistair had an alibi for the Paris theft. Miss Vance had an alibi for the London theft. The partnership theory, which had seemed so promising, dissolved into thin air. "It makes no sense," David went on, his voice a low grumble of confusion. "We have Sir Alistair, the ideologue with a passion for white roses, who couldn't have committed crime number 3. We have Miss Vance, the activist who buys the exact equipment needed for the job, who couldn't have committed crime number 1. It's as if the curator is a ghost who can borrow the motives and methods of other people at will." Miss Marple looked out of her window at the neat rows of her garden. "When a gardener wishes to confuse a rival at the flower show, David," she said thoughtfully, "they sometimes employ misdirection. If one is known for one's magnificent dahlias, one might make a great show of ordering tulip bulbs. And sometimes, a truly cunning person might take a weed from their rival's garden, a particularly distinctive weed, you understand, and plant it amongst their own prize-winning roses." "Aunt Jane, what are you talking about?" "Weeds?" "Tulips." "I am talking about clues that are too perfect, dear boy," she replied gently. "A famous rose expert, and a white rose is left at the crime scene. A specialist in repatriation, and a receipt for incriminating equipment is conveniently dropped in a public place. They are not clues, David. They are signposts. Deliberately planted to point you, and everyone else, in the direction of the two most obvious suspects in the world. You have not been investigating the criminals. You have been investigating the people they wish you to investigate." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The background noises of David's office, ringing phones, muted voices, seemed to fade as he absorbed her words. "Framed," he said at last, the word heavy with new meaning. "You think they're both being framed?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that we are dealing with a very clever and theatrical person indeed. Someone who is not merely committing a crime, but writing a story with characters and clues and a great deal of misdirection." As if on cue, a commotion erupted in the background of David's call. A voice shouted, "Sir, it's him. It's the curator." A message sent to every major news outlet in the world. "Aunt Jane, hold on," David said, his voice suddenly sharp and alert. Miss Marple could hear his muffled voice speaking to his colleagues, the words urgent and clipped. After a minute, he came back on the line, his tone transformed. The weariness was gone, replaced by a tense, focused energy. He's sent out a manifesto. A public statement. It's eloquent. All about the tyranny of possession and the redemption of stolen beauty. He's announced his next target. "And what is that?" Miss Marple asked, her own heart beating a little faster. "The Elgin marbles," David said, his voice grim. "He's not just threatening to steal them. He's announced the exact date and time he will liberate them. 2 weeks from today, at the stroke of midnight. He's turned it into a public spectacle. A countdown. A manifesto. A public challenge. This changed everything. This was not the behavior of a thief hiding in the shadows. This was the grand gesture of a performer stepping into the spotlight. The curator was not content with merely being a mystery, he wanted an audience. "Thank you for calling, David," Miss Marple said, her mind already racing ahead, arranging and rearranging this new, startling piece of the puzzle. "You have a great deal to do." She replaced the receiver in its cradle and sat for a long moment in the quiet of her cottage. Sir Alistair and Miss Vance were not the playwrights of this elaborate drama, as she had begun to suspect. They were merely the lead actors, unwitting puppets in a play written and directed by someone else entirely. The real culprit, the true curator, had been hiding all along, not in the shadows, but in the one place no one ever thinks to look, the director's chair. Chapter 7, The Understudy. The world held its breath. In the week leading up to the curator's deadline, the Elgin marbles became the most talked-about pieces of stone on the planet. Newspapers printed diagrams of the British Museum, television pundits debated security measures, and the international incident grew more toxic by the day. London was a city under siege, with a palpable tension in the air. In St. Mary Mead, however, the rhythms of life continued, albeit with a new and thrilling topic of conversation. The impending crime was discussed with the same morbid fascination usually reserved for the church fate's raffle results or a particularly scandalous sermon. Miss Marple knew the police and her nephew David were looking for a needle in a haystack, a phantom with a political motive. But she was convinced they were looking in the wrong haystack altogether. The clues, the manifesto, the sheer theatricality of it all, it was not the work of a political ideologue. It was the work of a performer. And performers, in her experience, were driven by something far more potent than politics, vanity. Her mind made up, she put on her hat and coat and walked not towards Old Hall, but to the sturdy, ivy-clad home of Colonel Weston. She found him, as she expected, in his study, a copy of the Telegraph spread before him, its front page dominated by a map of the museum's Duveen Gallery. "Ah, Jane," he boomed, rising to greet her. "Come to inspect the battle plans?" A shocking state of affairs. They should have the military in there. A proper cordon. "It is all very worrying, Colonel," Miss Marple agreed, accepting a small glass of sherry. It must be dreadful for poor Sir Alistair to have his life's work threatened by this vandal. Finch? Oh, he's taking it badly, the Colonel said, settling back in his leather armchair. Saw him in the village yesterday. Looked like death warmed up. The man's proud, you see. This is a direct attack on his legacy. He always struck me as a man who lived for his work, Miss Marple mused, steering the conversation. So dedicated. It is a pity he never had a protégé, I suppose. Someone to carry on his work, to share that immense knowledge. The Colonel grunted. Protégé? Not Finch style. Never suffered fools, or anyone he considered his intellectual inferior, which was most people. There was his nephew, of course. For a time. Miss Marple's expression remained one of mild, polite interest, betraying none of the sudden, intense focus that sharpened her thoughts. A nephew? I had not heard he had family. Julian Finch, the Colonel recalled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Dazzlingly clever boy, they said. Also worked at the museum, junior curator in the same department. But they were like oil and water. Alistair is a purist, a scholar. Young Julian was a showman. Always pitching these grand, theatrical exhibitions, wanting to bring in the crowds. Alistair despised it. Called it vulgarizing history . He took a sip of sherry, warming to his subject. There was a terrible falling out, I heard from a fellow at my club. Julian was in line for a big promotion, but Alistair blocked it. Said his nephew lacked the necessary scholarly temperament. Julian resigned. Made a huge scene, apparently. Accused his uncle of being a fossil, of turning the museum into a mausoleum. That was about a year ago. Haven't heard a peep about him since. A showman. A dazzlingly clever boy with a flair for the theatrical. A nephew who felt his brilliant career had been destroyed by his famous, purist uncle. It was all there. The motive was not ideology, it was revenge. A bitter, personal desire to humiliate the man who had scorned him. Julian wouldn't just steal from the museum his uncle loved, he would do it in a way that made a mockery of his uncle's entire philosophy, turning it into a grand, vulgar, populist spectacle for the whole world to watch. And the framing of Sir Alistair and Eleanor Vance? It was the masterstroke of a spiteful mind. Who better to know his uncle's passions than his own nephew? The white rose, a symbol of his uncle's singular pride, was the perfect, poetic signature to plant. And who better to frame as a potential partner than his uncle's most vocal and public professional rival? It was a cruel, intimate, and devastatingly effective piece of theatre. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, the setting sun casting long shadows before her. The whole affair, she thought, was very like the St. Mary Mead player's disastrous production of Richard III. The man playing the king had been earnest but dreadfully dull. It was the young amateur playing the Duke of Buckingham who had captured everyone's attention. He was ambitious and full of fire, and he used every scene to try and upstage the lead, to draw the audience's eye to his own clever performance. He did not care about the play itself, he only cared about proving he was the true star. Julian Finch was the understudy who had grown tired of waiting in the wings. So he had written his own play, casting his uncle as the tragic old king and himself as the brilliant, invisible protagonist. Back in her cottage, the grandfather clock in the hall struck 5. The world was watching London, waiting for the curator to make his move. They were looking for a phantom in a museum. But Miss Marple knew the director of the play was not on stage. He would be somewhere else entirely, watching his masterpiece unfold. With a look of calm resolution, she walked to the telephone and asked the operator for a trunk call to her nephew's office at Scotland Yard. The final act was about to begin, and it was time to bring down the curtain. Chapter 8: The Final Curtain. The night of the Curator's challenge was cold and clear. In London, a perimeter of police cordons and broadcast vans had turned the area around the British Museum into a fortress under siege. The world's eyes were fixed on Bloomsbury, awaiting the stroke of midnight. But the true theatre of the affair was taking place some 60 miles away, in the warm, firelit drawing room of a cottage in St. Mary Mead. At Miss Marple's urgent summons, a most unlikely group had assembled. Her great-nephew David stood grim-faced by the mantelpiece, his mobile phone buzzing intermittently with tense updates from his team. Sir Alistair Finch sat bolt upright in a chintz armchair, his face a pale mask of fury and anxiety. And in the opposite chair, Eleanor Vance watched the proceedings with a sharp, analytical gaze, her initial protests at being dragged from her in having subsided into wary curiosity. The air was thick with unspoken questions and accusations. Miss Marple, however, appeared entirely unruffled. She finished pouring a cup of tea for Sir Alistair, her hand perfectly steady. "It is a most exciting night," she began, her voice calm and gentle. "A grand finale. Though I fear the audience in London may be disappointed. You see, the Curator has no intention of going anywhere near the British Museum this evening. The performance is already over." 3 pairs of eyes stared at her. David opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand. "You have all been characters in a very cruel and elaborate play," she continued, her gaze moving from Sir Alistair to Miss Vance. "You, Sir Alistair, were cast as the arrogant mastermind. What better way to signify your involvement than with a white rose? Your singular, well-known passion. A beautiful, personal, and utterly damning piece of stagecraft." Sir Alistair flinched as if struck. "And you, Miss Vance," Miss Marple went on, turning to the American, "were cast as the radical accomplice. Your professional rivalry with Sir Alistair is public knowledge. A receipt for high-tech equipment, dropped so conveniently for me to see, provided the perfect suggestion of a partnership. You provided the means, Sir Alistair the motive. It was all wonderfully neat. But their alibis?" David interjected. "They are solid. It makes no sense." "Oh, but it makes perfect sense," Miss Marple said softly. "The alibis were part of the performance, too. Designed to create the maximum amount of confusion. To make the police, and the world, believe they were chasing a phantom of impossible genius. The author of this drama wanted you to be baffled. He wanted you to chase your tails." She paused, her knitting needles resting in her lap. "He wanted you to be looking at everyone except the one person you should have been." "Who?" Sir Alistair demanded, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The understudy, of course," Miss Marple said simply. "The one who has spent his life in the shadow of the great star, believing himself to be more brilliant, more deserving of the spotlight. The one whose ambition was thwarted and turned to a terrible, festering resentment. This was never about repatriating art, Sir Alistair. It was about destroying a legacy. It was about you." Sir Alistair's face, already pale, turned ashen. "Julian," he breathed. "Your nephew, Julian Finch," Miss Marple confirmed. "A young man described to me as a showman. A man who saw your museum not as a sacred trust, but as a stage he was not allowed to command. You blocked his career, you scorned his ideas, and in doing so, you created your own nemesis." She laid out the logic, piece by devastating piece. Julian, with his intimate insider's knowledge of the museum's layouts and security flaws. Julian, who knew of his uncle's passion for white roses and his fierce rivalry with Eleanor Vance. Julian, whose bitterness had curdled into a narcissistic desire for revenge, who used the noble language of repatriation as a cloak for a very personal and ugly vendetta. The thefts were real, she explained, but they were secondary. The true crime was the framing of the two of you. The goal was to humiliate you, Sir Alistair. To prove that his theatrical methods could succeed where your scholarly world had failed. To turn your life's work into a global spectacle, a vulgar circus, just as you always accused him of wanting to do. "Where is he?" David demanded, his hand already on his phone. "We have no address for him, no current whereabouts." "Think like a showman, David," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Where is the director on the opening night of his greatest triumph?" "He is not backstage. He is in the audience, watching the critics, savoring the applause. He will not be hiding. He will be somewhere comfortable, somewhere public, watching the news reports of the chaos he has created." She thought for a moment. That quiet, very exclusive hotel bar near the Haymarket, perhaps. The one with the comfortable armchairs. It seems his style. David stared at her for a second, then spoke urgently into his phone. An unbearable silence descended on the small room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic ticking of the clock. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. David's phone buzzed. He listened, his face impassive. He ended the call and looked at his great-aunt, his expression one of profound, unadulterated awe. "They found him," he said, his voice quiet. "At the bar of the Palace Hotel. Just as you said. Watching the news on a television set. He didn't even try to run. He just smiled. And confessed to everything." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the room. Sir Alistair buried his face in his hands. Miss Vance simply shook her head slowly, a look of weary disbelief on her face. Later, after Sir Alistair and a much chastened Miss Vance had been driven away, David remained. The global crisis had been averted, not by tactical squads and digital surveillance, but by village analogies and an elderly lady's understanding of a resentful heart. "How did you know, Aunt Jane?" he asked, a question he felt he would be asking for the rest of his life. "How could you possibly have known?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, the familiar click-clack of the needles a comforting return to normality. "Oh, it was really quite simple, dear boy," she said. "It reminded me so much of the terrible feud between the vicar and the choirmaster over the Christmas pageant. It was presented as a disagreement over theological doctrine, you see. But it was really all because the choirmaster felt he ought to have been allowed to sing the solo in Good King Wenceslas 30 years before." She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Human nature, David," she concluded softly. "It is so much the same whether it is in a village choir or a great museum. A wounded pride is a very dangerous thing indeed."